second of these seminars. This afternoon we move on to reason and mysticism in Islam. So I hand over to Father Michael without any further ado.
Well, thank you very much. It's actually, if you count the inaugural seminars that we had in December, this is actually the third sort of session. And in the first one, we looked generally at the question of the relationship between reason and revelation in Islam and in Christianity, the topic raised by Pope Benedict in his well-known Regensburg lecture. And then yesterday, we considered particularly reason and revelation in Islamic philosophy, what is, in inverted commas, Islamic philosophy, theology, and social history. So today, it's the turn of the relationship between reason and mystical experience. What I'm going to do is first to say something about mystical experience and how the Sufis, the mystics of Islam, saw the relationship between reason and the experience that they had had, and then go on to say something about how they saw this in relationship to the question of God and creation, which is a recurring theme. And thirdly, on the question, very important question in Islam as in Christianity, of the relationship between determination and freedom. So we'll see how that goes. So I want to begin with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, who's also known as Maulvi, the great mystic of Islam, originally from Balkh in Afghanistan, but of course settled and died in Iconium, or Konya as it is now known, in Asia Minor. So a lot has been written about Rumi, of course, particularly his understanding of the relationship of the soul to God and the nature of reality itself in the light of mystical experience. So the question has been asked, was he a monist? Did he believe that there was only one reality and just different manifestations of it? Was he a pantheist or a panentheist? Or was he, after all, a theistic mystic of the kind that can be instanced in Judaism and Christianity as well as Islam? Now, we will never know definitive answers to these questions. What we can do is to examine his treatment of mystical experience itself. Thus, for him, such experience must have the directness of sight. Just as our experience of the material world is based on physical organs of sight, so we can look out and see the sun and beautiful weather, so our experience of the unseen must also be based on spiritual sight. So thus he says, I quote, "Adami deedast, baki pustast, deed an bashat ke deed dustast." So to be human is to be able to see. The rest is mere skin, just outward appearance. The only sight worth the name is sight of the Divine Beloved. Doost in Farsi, dost in Urdu and Hindi, in other words. This comparing of physical sight with spiritual vision is extended to the other senses also. So again I quote, "Hisse abdan kut-e zulmat mi khorad, hisse jan az aftabi mi charad." The bodily sense is feeding on the food of darkness, while the spiritual sense is feeding on the sun. Allama Muhammad Iqbal, in his lectures, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, along with Rumi, calls the spiritual sense the heart and refers specifically to this passage in Rumi when he comments, the heart is a kind of inner intuition or insight, which in the beautiful words of Rumi feeds on the rays of the sun and brings us into contact with aspects of reality other than those open to sense perception. I mean, this is absolutely central to the claims of the mystics. Rumi himself puts it in this way, that this enlightening of the heart, illumination of the heart, is quite different from the enlightenment which comes from the use of the intellect and of the senses. Baz nur dil nur khudast, kiyozi akal o his pak o judast. So the light of the light enlightening the heart is the light of God. This is quite different and pure from the light of the intellect and of the sense. Another of the ways in which he compares mystical experience to ordinary knowledge is the difference, he says, between intellectual effort and the immediate experience of the proximity of the Divine Beloved. And the comparison is between the hunter merely following the tracks of a musk deer. The musk deer is a kind of mythical animal in Sufi poetry because it's supposed to have in its navel a kind of smell for which it is hunted, from which, of course, we get musk perfume and so on. So the hunter, he compares the intellectual pursuit to the hunter following the tracks of a deer and then catching something of its perfume. So daftar-e Sufi, sawad o harf neest, juz dil-e aspid misle barf neest. Zad-e danishmand asar-e qalam, zad-e Sufi cheest asar-e qadam. Hamchu sayadi sui ashkar shud, gaam-e ahudid obar asar shud. Chand gahish gaam-e ahu dar khor ast, baad azan khud naaf-e ahu rehbar ast. Ra raftan-e yak nafs bar buy-e naaf, khoshtar as sad manzil-e gam wa tawaf. So the Sufi's book is not composed of ink and letters. It is nothing but a heart white as snow. The scholar's provision is pen marks. What is the Sufi's provision? Footmarks. Like a hunter, he stalks his game. He sees the musk deer's tracks and follows them. For a while, the track of the deer is sufficient. After that, it is the navel or musk gland of the deer that is his guide. To go one breath guided by the smell of the musk gland is better than 100 stages of tracking and roaming. You see, so here shifts to smell rather than sight, the metaphor, the analogy. The Sufi's journey is a journey inwards. It is by journeying into one's interior life that one discovers the Beloved. Nigeh kardam andar dil-e khishtan, dar an jaish didam digar ja nabud. I gazed into the depths of my own heart. There I saw him. He was nowhere else. The striking thing about this verse is that last part, he was nowhere else. Does this mean that the poet is saying that the divine is only to be found in the interior life? Or is it just that the divine is seen in the interior life? An interesting point here is that this sentiment occurs in his Diwan-e Shams-e Tabrizi. The Diwan-e Shams-e Tabrizi, I think it's down here, was a love poem written to his spiritual beloved, a man called Shamsh Tabriz, who appeared out of nowhere, and Rumi fell in love with him, spiritual love, of course. And his other work is much more orthodox, if you like, with an eye to orthodoxy. But here it's very unrestrained, let's put it like that. As kinare khish yabam hardami man buya yar, chun nagiram khishtan ra harshabi andar kinar. From my bosom I catch continually a scent of the beloved. So it's not dost here, it is yar. How should I not each night take myself to my own embrace? Here, of course, the thought is not just of divine indwelling, but also of the self as somehow participating in such presence. In the Masnavi Manvi, which is his epic poem of 25,000 plus verses, such extravagance is qualified in the light of the prophetic tradition, takhallaku bi ikhlaq Allah, take on the characteristics of God. Or as Iqbal translates more strongly, create in yourselves the attributes of God. Takhallaku, I mean, this is an Arabic phrase, of course. Ikhlaq can also mean the way in which people live. Etiquette is probably too weak a word. For the Rumi of the Masnavi, such a taking on of the characteristics of God is compared to the way in which iron takes on the qualities of fire when it is left in it long enough. It does not lose the properties of iron and remains iron, but it acquires the heat and glow of the fire. Sibgat Allah hast khom e range hu, pisa yak ran gardad andaru. Chun andaran khom uftad o guyesh khom, astarab guyed manam khom la ta'lam. An manam khom khud anal haq guftanast, range atish darid illa ahanast. Range ahan mahv, range atish ast, zi atishi milafad o khamish vashast. Chun be surkhi gasht, ham chun zare khan, pas anal narast, lafish bi zaban. Shud zi rang o tabai atish muhattasham, guyad u man atisham man atisham. Atisham man gar tura shakast o zan, azmun kun dastra barman bizan. Adami chun nur gira das khuda, has masjud malaik zi ijtaba. So the baptism of Allah, Sibgat Allah, is a verse from the Quran which says something like the Christians say you must be baptized, but our baptism is from Allah. Sibgat Allah. The baptism of Allah is the dying vat of who? He who is. In it, piebald things become of one color. This is one thing quite mysteriously, I haven't worked out why this is so, but Jesus is often spoken of as making things of one color. So there's an infancy story about Jesus that his mother left him some things to dye different colors, and when she came back, he dyed them all one color. So piebald things become of one color. When the mystic falls into this vat and you say arise, qum, it's an Aramaic word, of course, also. Qum, rise, like Jesus saying to the little girl, Talitha qummi. He replies in ecstasy, I am the vat, do not complain. That saying, I am the vat, is the same as saying, I am God, Anal Haq. This was the cry of the famous mystic Hallaj, for which he was executed. He has the color of fire even if he's iron. the color of iron is noted in the color of the fire. It boasts of its fieriness, but is silent about itself. When it has become like gold from the mine in its redness, then without tongue it boasts, I am the fire. I am Anil-Haq, you see, Anil-Haq, I am the fire. It has become glorified by the color and nature of fire. It shouts, I am the fire, I am the fire, I am the fire. If you have any doubt or suspicion, come and test me, put your hand on me. When humans receive light from God, they are worshipped by the angels because they are the chosen. This, of course, refers to the command God gives the angels to worship Adam. And they all obey except Satan, who refuses. The spiritual birth of a mystic is compared to the birth of Jesus. Bang-e-haq andar hijab o bi-hijab, aan dehat ki udad Maryam ra azjib. E fana pusidgan zir pust, baz gardid as Adam zi awaz dust. The call of God, be it veiled or manifest, bestows that which he bestowed on Mary from his bosom. O you rotten with death under your skin, that is in your heart, return from non-being to being at the voice of the friend. The theme of returning to the Divine Beloved is again expressed in the Diwan-e-Shams-e Tabriz, in this way, in terms of birth. Har sui bang o mashghala, har kui shama o mashala, ki imshab jahan-e hamila, zayed jahan-e javedan. To gile badi, no, it's buddhi actually. Tu gile buddhi o dil shudi, jahil buddhi akil shudi. Aan kiyo kashidat in chunin, aan su kashand aan chunan. On every side is clamor and tumult. In every street, candle and torch. For tonight, the pregnant world gives birth to the eternal world. You were mere clay, you are now all heart, ignorant and now wise. The one who has brought you thus far will lead you on. Professor Reynold Nicholson, in his early work on Rumi, discerned much that was common between Plotinus and Neoplatonism on the one hand and Rumi on the other. In particular, he mentions the Neoplatonic understanding of the soul's return to the one from where it has originated. Epistrophe, the word is given on your sheets. Although Rumi may not have been acquainted with Plotinus' work directly, Nicholson concedes that, Neoplatonism was in the air. It was found in commentaries on Aristotle, for example, and received a significant impetus with the translation of the so-called theology of Aristotle. I mentioned this yesterday, those who were here, known in Arabic as Uthulugia. Translation made by the Christian Ibn Abdullah ibn Na'ima in the philosophical circle of Yaqub al-Kindi. This so-called theology of Aristotle is in fact a commentary on Plotinus' Enneads, and its influence on Islamic thought in general and Sufism in particular cannot be overstated. There is also the likelihood of what Professor Niall Green has called a semiotic koine, that is, a shared worldview and terminology common to Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the early period of Muslim rule in the Middle East. It may well be, therefore, that some of the details of the Sufi doctrine of the return have a Neoplatonic origin. For instance, the maqamat, or the ascending stages of the soul, by which the soul ascends from the inanimate to the botanical and from thence to the animal and the human as it continues its journey on the one. journey to the One. This, of course, many modern Muslims regard as anticipation of theories of evolution, but actually Anne-Marie Chemel is right to see it as having to do with Sufi mystical experience and the ascent back to the One from which the soul has come. So Rumi is very important in understanding. I mean, these concerns are very central to all Sufis, actually, but it's good to start with him because he is the best known of them. Then the question about God and creation and the question of time. There is a long history in the Islamic world regarding God's relation to the universe. The Quran undoubtedly echoes the biblical view of creation at a particular moment in time, without asking whether this is God's time or duration, or whether this is the temporality which comes into being with the rest of creation itself, as in the thought of St. Augustine. Under the influence of Aristotle, however, we saw this yesterday, the so-called Islamic philosophers developed the notion that because God is necessary being, he must also create necessarily. Eternal cause must have an eternal effect. And this led them to believe in the eternity of the world, with some holding that its necessity springs from its relation to the divine necessary being, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, while others could grant it was contingent on the divine but eternally so, Ibn Sina or Avicenna. In this crucial matter, Rumi takes the side of the great Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali in rejecting the doctrine of the world's eternity and upholding the orthodox Muslim view of creation in time. Interestingly, he does this not on philosophical or even theological grounds, as in Ghazali, but on the testimony of the prophets and the saints. Thus, in his famous table talk, Fihi Ma Fihi, this is the prose version of the Masnavi, of his poetical epic. He has this to say: Mardum ke migoyan alam kadim ast, sukhne ishan masmu ki bashad. Baz migoyan hadis ast, o an anbiya o awliya and, ke ishan kadim tar az alamand o haq ta'ala taqaza afrinish, e alam ra dar arwai ishan nehada, anga alam paida shud. پس ایشان علی الحقیقت میدانند که عالم حادث است، از مقام خود خبر میدند. مثلا ما در این خانه که نشسته ایم، عمر ما 76 است، دیدیم که این خانه نبود، سالی چند هست که این خانه شده است. اگر در این خانه جانورانی متولد شوند، ایشان را زایدند و خانه را معمور دیدند. اگر ایشان بگویند که این خانه قدیم است، بر ما حجت نشود. چون ما دیده ایم که این خانه حادث است، همچنان که آن جانوران که از در و دیوار این خانه رسته اند و جز این خانه چیزی نمی دانند و نمی بینند، خلقانند که از این خانه دنیا رسته اند، اندر ایشان جوهر علوی نیست. منبتشان از اینجا است، هم در اینجا فرو روند. اگر ایشان عالم را قدیم گویند، بر انبیا و اولیا که ایشان را وجود بوده است پیش از عالم به 100,000 سال، چه جای سال و چه جای عدد که آن را نه حد است و نه عدد. So people which say that the world is eternal, how can their words be listened to? Some say it is created. These are the prophets and the saints who are more ancient than the world. God Most High implanted the demand for the creation of the world in their spirits, and then the world appeared. So they know for a fact and report it on their own authority that the world is created. For instance, we who have dwelt in this house, our age is 60 or 70. This actually, by the way, fixes when this was written. We have seen that at one time this house did not exist. It has existed only for the last few years. If living creatures are born out of this house, when they are born, they see the house is already constructed. If they should then say this house is eternal, that would be no proof for us, since we ourselves have seen when this house was built. Just like those living things which have sprung out of the doors and walls of this house, and neither know nor see anything apart from this house, so there are creatures who have sprung out of the house of this world. They do not have the celestial essence in them. They have grown out of this place, and they likewise sink back into it. Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return, in other words. If they say the world is eternal, that will be no proof against the prophets and the saints, who existed millions of years before the world. And then in the brackets it is given, maybe by the editor, what place, years, and numbers when they are infinite and innumerable. The burden of the argument seems to be that the philosophers cannot deny the doctrine of creation because they have not been with God from eternity, whereas the prophets and saints can assert the truth of creation because they have seen it take place. This implies, of course, their pre-existence in some form before their appearance on earth. So the famous prophetic tradition that I was a prophet when Adam was just between water and clay. Renald Nicholson, in his translation and commentary on Muhammad Iqbal's Asrar-e-Khudi, The Secrets of the Self, points out that the prophetic tradition, Lima Allah Waqt, I have a time with God, implies a sense of timelessness, such as that referred to by Rumi. This gives the prophets a more intimate knowledge of God's will and work than that of the philosophers, that they, for all their ingenuity, could ever hope to attain. In the Diwan-e-Shams-e Tabriz, Rumi speaks of creation in a way that suggests Neoplatonic influence. Yak kohori chu beza joshid o gash darya, kaf kard o kaf zameen shod, wazi dood-e oo sama shod. Al-haq neha sipahi-e poshide padashahi. Har lehza hamle awad anga ba-asal washod. So the one substance boiled like an egg and became a veritable sea. It foamed, and the foam became the earth, and from its smoke came the sky. In truth, a hidden army with an invisible king continually sets forth and then returns to its source. Nicholson regards this as an allusion to emanation and return in the Neoplatonic sense. This sense of continuity in creation is also found in the Masnavi, a reference to the Quranic verse, Surat Al-Rahman 59, Kul yomin huwa fi shanin bikhan, marwara bikar o bifeli medan. Recite every day he is in some affair. Do not deem him idle and active. The continual creative activity of God, which of course is behind the Asherite occasionalism, that God is continually creating the attributes in what exists, so that nothing is fixed except by the divine will. there is not only continuity but the continual renewal of creation. Har nafs no mi shavad dunya uma bi khabar az no shudan andar baqa. Every moment the world is being renewed, but we are unaware of its renewal as it remains the same in appearance to us. So here Rumi is influenced by the ubiquitous atomism of Islamic thought, based a continuing creation on continuous divine activity in keeping the atoms in existence and in creating the accidents which gave material things their thisness. Duns Scotus's Securitas. So, I mean, yesterday we were looking at Aquinas and Averroes, but here there are great similarities with the Scotist view. I think, Father Andrew, you mentioned that yesterday. Any possibility of qualities inhering permanently in aggregations of matter was denied, thus making any sense of natural law or empirical science more difficult to promote. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, in spite of the great scientific endeavors in the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, empirical science did not arise there, but in Europe. Because the universe lives and moves and has its being within the divine life, therefore it is itself alive. Hum chunan in jahan pishe nabi ghar ke tasbih ast u pishe ma ghabi. Pishe chashmish in jahan porish kodad, pishe chashme digaran murde o jamad. Pasto bala pishe chashmish Tiz Rav, as kuluh o khisht o nukte shanab. Just as to the prophet this world is plunged in glorifying God, while to us it seems heedless, to his eye the world is filled with love and bounty. While to others it appears dead and inert, to his eye vale and hill are swift in motion. He hears subtle truths from clod and brick. Rumi has in mind here the Quranic passage which declares that the seven heavens and the earth and all of them and everything in them is declaring the glory of God. But we are unaware of how they are doing this. The prophets and friends of God are aware that the world is alive to God and He to them as their Lord and Master. Baad o khak o aab o atish bandeyan, ba man o tu murde ba haq zindeyan. Air and earth, water and fire are God's servants. To you and me they may seem dead, but to Him they are alive. It is not only that the elements are alive to God, but every particle in the universe is aware and responsive. Jumle ajzaye jahan pishe awam, murde o pishe khuda dana o ram. To the vulgar, all the particles of the world seem dead, but before God they are aware and responsive. We cannot claim that Rumi is a panpsychist in the systematic sense of believing that every existent in the universe is alive, in the way that Muhammad Iqbal is, depending on the spiritual pluralism of his mentors, James Ward and John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart. However, Iqbal appeals to Rumi to show how what he calls egohood develops from the inanimate to the animate, to consciousness and then to self-consciousness. Such a view of evolution he regards as fundamentally teleological, as against a view of it as merely random and without purpose. While there are flights of fancy, especially in the Divan, which could be thought of as monistic, Rumi does also value true knowledge of the self within the flow of divine life. Self-knowledge is one of the attributes of the servant of God, Abdullah, and the hidden self is brought out and developed by the Prophet's message. So he has another set of writing, the quatrains, the rubaiyat, 4-line poems. In that, Rumi has this to say about true self-knowledge. Man bande an qawmam ke khud ra danand, har dam dil khud ra az ghalat berehanand. I am that people's slave who truly themselves know, thus saving themselves from error gross. This recalls the well-known prophetic tradition, man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. The one who knows himself knows his God. In his table talk, he refers with approval to a saying of the 9th century strict ascetic and Sufi Sahel Abdullah Tustari. Sahel ibn Abdullah Tustari, rahmatullah alayhu, گفت مومن به راستی آن کس است که از نفس خود و دل خود غافل نیست. So truly the believer is the one who is not heedless of his own soul and his own heart. Such a believing self cannot be lost. Indeed, the whole world is lost in him. And Rumi recalled the famous story of the Prophet of Islam when he was a child getting lost in the desert, and his nurse was looking for him and getting more and more concerned about where he was. And a voice came saying, "Don't worry about him. He can't be lost in the world. The whole world will be lost in him." The point being made is that in the union of the believer with the divine, the believer begins to will in entire harmony with the will of God Himself. When this happens, the value of the believer is immeasurably enhanced. Jaan-e kul ba jaan-e juz asib kad, jaan azu duri stid da jeeb kad. Again, this is a reference, the allusion here is to the Blessed Virgin. The universal came into contact with the individual soul. This soul received from it a pearl and made it its own. So the prophetic proclamation shakes us out of our slumber and makes us aware of the treasure within us. We see then that in his doctrine of creation, on the one hand, he is very influenced by Neoplatonism in how he describes creation, and also by the developing Sufi idea of absorption into the divine. On the other hand, he tries to defend creation as revealed in the Quran. And this tension is never really resolved in Rumi, as indeed in other Sufis, even in Al-Ghazali. Coming now to the question of the relationship between determinism, predestination, if you like, and free will, all scholars, Western and Eastern, recognize the moral seriousness of Rumi's work. And it is this moral concern that underpins Rumi's views on predestination, moral responsibility, and human freedom. So, reflecting on the prophetic tradition that true faith is between predestination and free will, al-iman bain al-jabr wa al-qadr. Rumi relates the reply of the prophets to the people of Saba, who were claiming that they could not repent because they were bound by divine decree to continue in sin. Well, this is something that we hear sometimes from people. Anbiya guftand ke ari afarid, wasaf haiye ke natan zi an sar kashid, wa afarid o wasaf haiye arzi ke kasi mabghuzi mi gardad razi. The Prophet said, yes, he has created some attributes from which it is impossible to free ourselves. for example, our physical nature. But he's also created other attributes from which hated persons can free themselves and become acceptable to God. Iqbal also refers to this hadith in his correspondence with Renald Nicholson. And in his Persian work, he refers to it in a Persian form, Iman darmiyan jabar o qadaras. The self, according to him, attains to freedom by removing all obstacles that block its path. It is partly free and partly determined, and it reaches fuller freedom even as it draws near to the one who is most free, that is God. In his table talk, Rumi declares that the doctrine of predestination means the creation of a moral order by which the good is rewarded and evil is punished. According to him, this order is fixed and never changes. What can change is the amount of good or evil that we do and the recompense we receive from it. I quote, "What God Most High has decreed in eternity, that there shall be good for good and evil for evil, that decree will never change. For God Most High is wise. How should He say, 'Do evil, that you may find good'? If someone sows wheat, will he gather barley? Or if he sows barley, will he gather wheat? That is impossible. All the saints and prophets have said that the recompense of good is good and that of evil is evil." So he quotes here from the Quran, فَمَنْ يَمَلُ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَهُ وَمَنْ يَمَلُ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَهُ. So this is Surah Al-Zalzala, Surah 99. So the one who has done a grain's worth of good will see it, and the one who's done even a grain's worth of evil will see it. So he goes on, if you mean by the eternal decree what we have stated and expounded, that never changes. Ma'ad Allah, God forbid. But if you mean to say that the recompense of good and evil increases and so changes, that is to say, the more good you do, the greater good you will receive, and likewise the more wrong you do, the greater evil you will see, there certainly change enters in, but the original decree does not change. In an Urdu poem, Iqbal expresses this view by exclaiming, "Taqdeer hai ek naam mukafat amal ka." Destiny is one name for the recompense of deeds. Rumi held that free will must exist because we behave as if it did. So there is a story in the Masnavi where he said if a man is walking under a house and a brick falls on him, he does not blame the brick. But if somebody throws a brick down on him, then he definitely blames the man. Here his approach is similar to that of some modern linguistic philosophy, for example, J.L. Austin, which holds that close attention to the structure of language reveals that assumptions of free will are structured into our thought and language. Maulana Shibli Nomani, whose work on Rumi I mentioned yesterday, remarks that Rumi believed free will to be manifest in our assigning of praise or blame towards ourselves and towards other human beings. I quote Shibli Nomani, "इंसान के तमाम अफ़ाल और अक़वाल से इख्तियार का सबूत होता है। हम जो किसी को किसी बात का हुक्म देते हैं, किसी काम से रोकते हैं, किसी पर गुस्सा ज़ाहिर करते हैं, किसी काम का इरादा करते हैं, किसी फ़ेल पर नादिम होते हैं, ये तमाम अमूर इस बात की दलील हैं कि हम मुखातिब को और अपने आप को फ़ाइल मुख्तार ख्याल करते हैं." Free will is proved by all of humanity's deeds and words. When we command someone to do something or prevent them from doing it, when we show anger towards another or decide upon a course of action, when we are penitent about something we have done, all of these are proofs that we consider the other and ourselves free agents. So Nomani goes on to quote from Rumi, وَآن پشیمانی کے خوردی از بدی زی اختیار خویش گشتی محتدی جمله قرآن امر او نہیں است او وحید امر کردن سنگ مرمر را کی دید هیچ دانه هیچ عاقل این کند با کلوخ و سنگ خشم و کین کند غیر حق را اگر نباشد اختیار خشم چون می آیدد بر جرمدار چون همی خواهی تو دندان بر ادو چون همی بینی گناه و جرم او. The penitence which you have felt for an evil deed, you've been led to it through your power of choice. The entire Quran consists of commands, prohibitions, and threats. Whoever saw commands given to a piece of marble? No wise or reasonable person does this, showing anger and hostility at clods and stones. If none but God has the power of choice, why do you become angry with the offender? Why do you gnash your teeth at a foe? Why notice his sin and crime? Iqbal, discussing the same issue, refers to the hadith about the power to choose, and quotes a very interesting verse from Rumi. Bal bazara sue sultan burad, bal zagara ba Goristan burad. Wings carry falcons to the king. Wings also carry crows to the graveyard. The allusion here is no doubt to the Zoroastrian practice of exposing their dead at the dakhmas, the word is there, the towers of silence. You may have seen them in Iran, Pakistan, and India. So the bodies are left exposed, and these attract all kinds of scavenging creatures. In other words, what he's saying is, we've been endowed with certain capacities. How we use them will determine our final destiny. There are certain features of our lives that are given, but within what is determined, we have the freedom to act either towards virtue or towards vice. How we choose to act will then be decisive. For Rumi, the ordaining of a moral order encourages us to moral earnestness and does not in any way encourage moral laziness. Hum chunin tawil qad jafa al qalam, behar tahriz as bar shughul ahm. Pas qalam be nawisht ke har kar ra laik an has tasir o jaza. Kaj ravi jafa al qalam, kaj ayadat. Rasti ari saadat zayadat. چون به دزدد دست شد جفا القلم خورد باده مست شد جفا القلم بلکه معنی آن بود جفا القلم نیست یکسان پیش من عدل و ستم معنی جفا القلم کی آن بود که جفا ها با وفا یکسان بود بل جفا را هم جفا القلم و آن وفا را هم وفا Jafa al-Qalam. This is the phrase, the pen has dried, in Islamic thought, summed up very beautifully in Omar Khayyam's quatrain that you may know about, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all your piety nor wit can cancel half a line, nor all your prayers wipe out a word of it. So, the interpretation of the hadith, the pen has dried, is for the purpose of inciting us to a great work. So the pen wrote that for every action there is a proper effect and consequence. The pen has dried means that if you act wrongly, you will suffer wrong. If you act rightly, the result will be your felicity. When someone steals, his hand is severed. Of course, refers to the Sharia penalty for theft. The pen is dried. If he drinks wine, he becomes drunk. The pen has dried. In fact, the meaning of the pen has dried is this: justice and oppression are not equal in God's sight. How can the pen has dried be taken to mean that unfaithfulness and faithfulness are alike? No, unfaithfulness will be rewarded with its like, and faithfulness will be rewarded by faithfulness. This is what the pen has dried means. A little earlier, he puts it somewhat more pithily. Qaul bande Shah Allah kana, behre an neest ke tambal kundaran, balke tahrizas baraye ikhlaq o jid, ke dar an khidmat soon shav musta'id. The saying of God's servant, whatever God wills comes to pass, does not mean that we should become lazy. It is rather an encouragement to sincerity and diligence, so that we may be exceedingly ready for service. Adam was forgiven because he acknowledged that he had done wrong, whereas Satan was not excused when he pleaded divine foreknowledge and foreordination of his own rebellion. Guft shaitan ke bima aghwiyatni, kard fail khud niha dev dani. Guft Adam ke zalamna anfusna, uzi fail haq nabud ghafil chuma. So Satan this is a Quranic reference. Satan said, "You have led me astray," to God. The vile devil thus concealed his own action. Whereas Adam said, "We have wronged ourselves." Unlike us, he was not heedless of how God works. This emphasis, this Quranic emphasis, zalamna anfusna, is, I think, unique to the story of the fall of the first human beings in the Quran, as an insight where it is not just wronging God, but wronging ourselves in what we have done. The references are to Quran 7 and to Quran 15. So Adam's transgression is forgiven. This is quite widespread in Islamic thought because he acknowledged his responsibility for it and repented. Satan, on the other hand, becomes the prototype of those who impute their own bad intentions and misdeeds to God. Shibli Nomani, Rumi's biographer, points out that involuntary infidelity is a contradiction in terms. Here is how Rumi puts it in verse. Zan ke bikhaye tu khud kufre tu nist. Kufre bikhayish tanakus guftanist. Without your will, your unbelief, kufr, does not exist at all. Involuntary unbelief is self-contradictory talk. So the way in which Islam has tried to resolve this problem between God's decree and human free will, one way has been to speak of God as the only real agent and creator of everything, good and evil, but human beings somehow have the capacity to acquire for themselves their actions. But the way in which Rumi interprets this is to say something like, when a person does something, they don't understand the full implications, the full extent of what they have done. They are limited in their understanding of what they have done. It is only God who understands the complete implications of what they have done and its consequences. Something like that. As we shall see tomorrow, there's a great deal of debate about this in modern Islamic thought as well. And Iqbal tries to resolve the dilemma by saying that God is the creator of the whole domain, as it were, of human action. But what human beings do within this domain has to do with their power of choice. So Rumi says that even within this context that dost darad yar in ashuftagi koshish behude bi as khoftagi. Even the friend loves this agitation, this effort on our behalf. It is better to struggle vainly than just to lie still. Behude means, people understand what behude means? It's in Urdu and Hindi, it is almost an abuse. To call somebody behuda means somebody who's without. So in Persian also it means the same thing. So even that kind of effort, even useless effort, is better than doing nothing, in other words. And then he says again, Gar tawakkul mi kuni darkar kun, kisht kun, pas takiye bar jabbar kun. If you are putting your trust in God, trust in Him as regards your work. Sow your seed first, then rely on the Almighty. There's a famous story in Rumi about the animal saying to the lion, you mustn't go out hunting us, just trust in God. And the lion says, no, but my hunting is part of God's will. Tomorrow, we shall see how modern thinkers have tried to resolve this issue. Because, of course, one of the concerns that they had was that an easy doctrine of predestination had led to fatalism and therefore to inaction, and that people needed to be woken up if they were going to change their condition. So thank you very much for your patience in listening, and I look forward to the responses.
Thank you very much for such a rich presentation. So without any delay, we turn to Father Andrew to give his response. A slight delay of give the microphone across.
Thank you.
In touch.
Thank you.
Would you want the magnet? Would you just switch it on?
Put it there. I'm conscious that I want to allow enough time for people's questions and discussion points today. We have half an hour left, and I'm sure there will be lots of interesting questions that arise from Dr. Michael's presentation. So once again, Dr. Michael, I'd like to thank you for your paper and to make a brief response that will serve as a further stimulus for questions, hopefully, for clarifications and also discussions. I'd like to welcome those present, especially any new participants, and I think we've got quite a few new people here today. And I'd like to thank those who attended yesterday for your continued presence and for the questions and comments, which were very good, a very good standard of discussion yesterday. Perhaps those who didn't ask a question or make a comment yesterday might feel comfortable enough to do so today, but silence is also a respected option. It's usually the one I take. I don't know about you. I don't want to as it were, respond directly to the paper today, but I want to take yesterday's paper and today's paper together and make a Christian response. And hopefully these will hang together. So what seems clear to me is that where Islamic mysticism and Christian mysticism converge, it is because what Michael calls, quoting Niall Green, the semiotic koine. I love that expression. It's helpful, isn't it? Yeah. The semiotic koine that they share. Clearly, Sufism, for example, has some relationship with Christianity. To what extent, it will come as no surprise to you, is much debated. There may be some experts here today, or people who are involved in research on that issue, so please, again, don't hide your light under a bushel. As Michael has shown us, within the Islamic tradition with a big T, reason and mysticism are not incompatible. They are not strangers to one another. And certainly in the work of Nazir-Ali, who we heard of yesterday, and of Rumi, who we've heard more of today, they're held up as very helpful examples in your presentation of those who have attempted a synthesis between reason and mystical experience. To take two of your examples, we might say that Al-Ghazali upholds the possibility and the use of reason in the pursuit of both a personal experience and a mystical contemplation of Allah. Rumi's was a profound mystical quest for God, but he never dispensed with the application of rational inquiry. There are, of course, numerous Christian parallels of those who sought to synthesize mystical experience with rational insights. Within roughly the same time frame, we have Meister Eckhart's Catherine of Siena, and in the English tradition, sometimes less well-known, Julian of Norwich, a particular favourite of mine. And in the early modern period, of course, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And of course, there is much speculation to what extent John of the Cross was influenced by Islamic thinking and mysticism. These are also helpful examples, I think. Again, we find ourselves making the same observation as yesterday. In Islam and Christianity, the great tradition is made up of several distinct sub-traditions that have more similarities than differences, but which have significantly different emphases to make them both distinct, but also complementary. Certainly within Christianity, this is appropriate in the realm of mystical prayer and asceticism, because we expect God to relate to us, in some sense, personally. Our unique differences matter to God. He takes account of the particular personal mode of the receiver. And I think there's a stronger sense of that in Christianity, and it's something that was raised yesterday, the personal nature of the relationship between God and the mystic, if we want to use that word, the believer, the person at prayer. It is arguable whether or not this truth is appreciated more in Christian mysticism than in Islamic mysticism. I personally think it is. We touched on this yesterday. During the time for questions and discussion, you may wish to take up this question again. When, as a Catholic Christian, I read in Al-Ghazali the following words of his Find a Home in Me. Put on the virtues of God, because the perfection of believers is found in drawing near to their Lord in order to take on some of his praiseworthy attributes: knowledge, righteousness, goodness, kindness, beneficence, mercy, good counsel, exhortation to do good, and warning against doing evil. Spiritually and religiously, it resonates. I also see the need to understand this statement in an analogical sense, such as has been suggested by Aquinas when involving God talk. Again, there's less clarity for me on that issue, seemingly within the Islamic tradition, certainly with regard to the figures who we have looked at in the past 2 days. So when as a Christian I read Al-Razali and he says this, reason is God's measure on earth, I instinctively read, or perhaps read into it, the Logos is God's measure on earth. Which leads me to think of who Jesus Christ is for me. When I read the hadith quoted by Michael, God created Adam in his image, again we've heard some reference to Adam today elsewhere in Rumi, I think of how Jesus Christ, the eternal Logos, has shared our human nature, Adam's nature, in the incarnation, and so understand that the human and the divine are united, but also distinct in his person, in his particular person. And I think that goes to the root of Christian mysticism, the relationship between God and man in the person of Christ. And then the subsequent encounter of the Christian mystic with the person of Christ. As I ponder the challenges faced by Islamic Kalam, presented so helpfully by Dr. Michael, I'm also inclined to agree with his observation that without a properly Trinitarian theology, the question is how the divine unity is safeguarded. So we can speak of the relationship between a God and humanity. We can discuss pantheism, panentheism, mystical theism. But really, the heart of the question is, what's the relationship between the Christian understanding of God as Trinity and the Islamic view of God as a unity? Sometimes perhaps we need to recognize what appear like internal theological contradictions between some of the Islamic traditions that we have encountered. Of course, this issue goes to the core of the theological difference and debate between Islamic and Christian thought. A further issue arises, and I just throw this in from my own perspective and my own research. I think perhaps as well Gavin might have something to say about this, perhaps Martin will too. Catholic Christians in the post-Vatican II era have a commitment to two principles which are pertinent to the questions raised by the debates in today's presentation and yesterday's, and no doubt tomorrow's as well. These are the Catholic commitment to a confident belief in what is called the universal salvific will of God. The other is the Catholic commitment to a belief in the universal call to holiness. In this way, the Catholic tradition does not allow a form of double truth, as we spoke of yesterday. All are called personally and equally to the same potential holiness of life. And all are called personally and equally to share in the salvation offered by God. We are all called, to some extent, to mysticism, although we don't think we are. Garrigou-Lagrange, associated with this place, was a great influence on that teaching, that we are all called to holiness. And in fact, he believed that, correct me if I'm wrong, that infused contemplation should be the norm for a believer. Everyone should be a mystic in action. In principle, de jure, there is no two-tier system of theology or grace or opportunity for holiness and salvation, Justice demands this, and a just God must will it. This equality of opportunity and this personal call are best seen within the framework of the Christian view of who they believe Jesus to be. By virtue of his incarnation, the God-man. By virtue of his passion and cross and resurrection, the Saviour. By virtue of his divinity, the divine reason, the divine logos, the divine word, a divine person. By virtue of his sacred humanity, the embodiment of the divine image in man, the new Adam, full of grace and truth, as John's Gospel says, whom each human person is called to imitate, but also to enter into spiritual union with. So many, I think, of these questions are somehow resolved in a deeper understanding of who Jesus is. And that's really the question that Christians and Muslims in dialogue need to look at with regard to this question of the relationship between mysticism and reason. So are there any questions or comments? And does anyone want to start us off?
Thank you both so much. I was just wondering, in what you were saying about the Quranic interpretation of the story of the fall, of not just wronging God, but wronging ourselves, and then earlier the moral order of giving rise to moral earnestness instead of moral laziness. I think that one question that's unanswered for me is, what is Rumi's and the mystics' understanding of human nature? Because I think that's key to understanding then, in dialogue with the person of Christ. And yeah, if you could just elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, as Father Andrew has said, there are contradictions here of many different kinds. So I think the Quranic insight that Adam said, it's not just Adam, actually, the words are in plural. Zalamna anfusna, we have wronged ourselves. So it's Adam and Eve. Eve can't be let off in this context. We have wronged. I think that is an authentic insight. But generally in Islam, the whole idea of original sin as the sin of Adam, as it were, being passed on, is denied. And the view is that, the popular view is a kind of tabula rasa, and then human beings then either do the wrong or the right. But there is a very well-known prophetic tradition which says that no one has been born in this world who has not been touched by the devil, except Jesus and his mother. I mean, this is a very well-known hadith. So that, of course, leads one to believe that the contagion of the sin of Adam and Eve is somehow still communicated down the generations. When in dialogue with Muslims, the claim is made that, human beings are innocent until they become guilty, I often refer to this tradition. How do you understand this then? It is also, of course, incidentally, independent confirmation of the Immaculate Conception.
I'm a visitor, so it doesn't matter. No, it's possible. Well, we're all visitors, really.
I find that the idea of searching for the mystical, the combination of the hunting metaphor and the light metaphor seems to me difficult. Now, I sort of know it from a much later Christian, but he is not a theologian thinker. I'm not sure how it works. This is Van Herman. Van Herman talks about is not exactly a mystic, but he does. He has like an interesting quasi-theological argument why reason is bad. To really know, reason is the punishment. It's part of the punishment of
Yeah.
sin. And to even though he's a he's an empirical scientist, but to really know we need to search into ourselves, and hand in hand he has this idea of hunting epistemology. That's his. I never figured it out with him, but I also cannot understand it here. Right, so it seems to me that the mystic experience, the best analogy is that of light, right? It strikes you and you cannot other, right? While the search always ends with a hypothetical, with fallible, with a temporary conviction.
In Sufism, I mean in Islamic mysticism, there are two movements, as it were. So there is the maqamat, they are the stations by which a mystic discovers a path to nearness to God, to even to oneness with God. And these have to do with things like repentance, it has to do with a disciplined prayer life, it has to do with fasting, and all of those things. But then the other movement is what they call ahwal, which are states that are sent by God, so they are purely of grace. It's nothing to do of grace, so it's nothing to do with human effort. And here, of course, I have to go back to Father Andrew's point about the extent of the relationship with Christianity. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about Sufism is its emphasis on love. And of course, love of God and God's love for us is mentioned in the Quran, but it's not so dominant as in the New Testament or in the Bible generally. And so the question is, where did this come from? I'm preparing another lecture for Oxford on the references to Jesus in Islamic literature. And very often the references have to do with love of God. I mean, in the sense of an Islamic Jesus. Muhammad Iqbal says, quite honestly, that one of the reasons for the rise of Sufism, only one of the reasons, not the only reason, was the way in which the Muslims saw the Christian monks of Egypt and Syria living, their way of life. But I think it's not just their way of life, I think it is also some of their beliefs. I think love of God is certainly one of them, to achieve this kind of dominance. I mean, Father Andrew was mentioning some of these the similarities with Western Christian mystics, but actually in the rise of Sufism, Syriac Christian mysticism, Ephraim the Syrian, for instance, later on Isaac of Nineveh, I mean, these are very important, the school of Nisibis, the developing idea, I mean, going back to your question about God, His Word, and His Spirit, I mean, this also becomes a matter for discussion among the Sufis. And it is quite remarkable what is said about this. So, as I was saying yesterday, so in the later Sufis, Ibn Arabi onwards, the objection is not to a doctrine of incarnation, but why Christians limit it to one person. So, every mystic should see themselves, therefore, as the location of God's presence in some way. And this, of course, led to a lot of difficulty and persecution for the Sufis in Orthodox Islam. Many of them were killed for that.
Just going back to something that Father Andrew was talking about, the kind of the compatibility between religious experience and reason. I was very struck in terms of your presentation how the different interrelations between mysticism and reason were teased out. On the one hand, you've got direct echoes of Neoplatonic thought, and on the other hand, you've got a kind of mystical critique of reason, that direct experience is superior to theological reasoning. But then you've actually got reasoning that's going on, because you talked about Rumi and freedom of action. Well, it struck me that there was quite a lot of reasoning that was going on in the analysis of that situation. So it's interesting how these kind of strands were there, and kind of just within the theme which we're looking at, how then religious experience and reason are intertwined and compatible. Is actually strikes me as a very rich basis for a reasoned dialogue between Christianity and Islam, whether it's on the level of mysticism or religious experience or otherwise. So I think that was fascinating, the way that.
I mean, I think the brief answer to that is that even mystics need a structure of thought. So, I mean, Neoplatonism provided that. I mean, for Christians also, I mean, Pseudo-Dionysius, the scheme of which is Neoplatonic, I think is the basis for Christian and Muslim mysticism, and possibly also Jewish. That is what was happening in this semiotic koine that I mentioned, that Neoplatonism was providing the structure for discussing these matters.
Thank you, Father, for this seminar. Thank you for your presentation, Father. My question is also probably about the foundational basics, because I'm new in the area, and I'm trying to understand in how far we can compare the Christian anthropology to the Islamic anthropology when it comes to reason, and maybe at times, if I may ask for a comparison of how in Christianity we think of God as infinite intelligence and love, and since we are created in His image, we are capax Dei, we are able to think God, and because He is intelligible, we can think Him in an ordered way. And in the end, when it comes to mysticism, it's that our reason is capable of God and is illuminated by Him. And in what way is that similar in Islam or different?
Yeah, this is, you see, generally Islam emphasizes the difference, so that there is no question of comparing anything human with anything divine. But then you have this prophetic tradition, which is widely quoted, even by Ghazali, the great Orthodox sort of champion of orthodoxy, that God created Adam in His image. And once you grant that, then of course analogical language becomes possible. And the Sufis and other Islamic theologians use it in that way. So how the two anthropologies work out, for example, in the relationship of women to men, that is different. You can ask why that should be different. And there were women mystics, Sufi mystics, and they were always struggling for their experience to be recognized as authentic. I think the relational aspect of a Christian anthropology, which is grounded, I mean, as Father Andrew was saying, in the doctrine of the Trinity itself, is weaker in Islam, because the tendency in Sufism is to lapse from saying God is one to saying everything is one. You see, this is constantly happening. And we may say this is a category mistake, but actually it happens all the time, that the oneness of God is seen to be denying multiplicity of any kind, not just anthropological.
This might be totally disconnected, but does Sufism have any type of influence on Spinoza's philosophy?
Spinoza, he was certainly influenced by certain Eastern ideas, but I think they were more Indic rather than Islamic. But he may have been influenced. I mean, of course, this raises the question: what's the relationship between Sufism and Indian or Hindu and Buddhist mysticism? And this is very controversial. I had a teacher called R.C. Zainer in Oxford. He's sniggering. Who tried to show that one of the famous Sufis, Bayezid of Bistam, had an Indian teacher who'd been a Hindu convert to Islam, and that he learned much of his mystical terminology from Hinduism. I think there is a connection in some of the terminology that Sufis use, but I don't know if there is there's direct influence. Even in Indian Sufism, the things like Wahadat al-Wujud, the unity of all existence and so on, there is no reference made to an already existing Indian tradition. The references are always back to Middle Eastern discussions like Ibn Arabi or Al-Jili and so on. So Allama Iqbal actually, who is regarded, I mean, we will look at him next time, but he says in a very important article that the problem with the doctrine of the Trinity is that neither Christians nor Muslims have understood it properly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a very good way to begin a dialogue. Okay, if we haven't understood it, let's now look at it.
I mean, just very, I mean, there's no direct reference in Sufi mysticism to Indian authority. In a way, that the opposite way was also true. As
Yes,
you'll know that there's no reference to Islam in classical Indian thought.
Of course, yeah.
Because they just ignored it. I mean, well, they kind of made kind of oblique references by, well, it seems that they made oblique references by using Buddhism as kind of the target when they were thinking about Islam. But no, it's fascinating. But that's next homework for you.
Spinoza, very interesting question,
You can bring that to tomorrow.
What's a quick homework?
So we must finish, but we have one further instalment to come, and I encourage you all to come for that, because it's just very much kind of continue and add such a rich element to this whole discussion. Tomorrow, Father Michael is going to talk about reason, modernism, and revival in Islam, in which there's certainly been a very significant interaction with modern kind of reason, hasn't there? So thank you both once again for today. Thank you very much.